Hello, everyone. Welcome to a journey through history's darkest hours, where empires crumbled, leaders miscalculated, and the fate of the world was rewritten in blood and ash. This is not just a story of war. It's a story of choices, consequences, and the high cost of human pride. The 20th century began with confidence, nations thriving, technologies booming, and empires stretching across continents. Yet, beneath the surface of progress, the world was a ticking time bomb. In 1914, one gunshot in Sarajevo set off a chain reaction that plunged the globe into the First World War. But it wasn't the bullet that caused the war. It was the decisions that came after. Strategic miscalculations, rigid alliances, national pride, and a widespread belief that the conflict would be short and glorious led to 4 years of trench warfare, chemical weapons, and unprecedented destruction. And when peace finally came, it wasn't peace at all. The Treaty of Versailles punished Germany harshly, sowing resentment, economic collapse, and the perfect conditions for a charismatic dictator to rise. Adolf Hitler capitalized on fear and humiliation. And once again, the world's leaders hesitated. Their attempts to avoid another war became the very reason it happened. These were not random acts of fate. They were choices, deliberate, avoidable, and tragically short-sighted. In this documentary, we revisit the pivotal decisions that turned political tension into global catastrophe. We explore how egos, misjudgments, and fear changed the course of history, not once, but twice. Because history, if left misunderstood, doesn't just repeat itself, it strikes back, harder. In 1914, the world was not prepared for what was coming. Europe stood at the height of its imperial power. Kings and emperors ruled vast territories. Cities buzzed with industrial progress. Railways connected nations, and telegraphs transmitted messages across continents in seconds. But underneath this surface of order and advancement, the continent had become a pressure cooker of ambition, fear, and mutual suspicion. The great powers, Britain, France, Russia, Germany, Austria-Hungary, were locked in a dangerous game. Military alliances were forged, not in trust, but in fear of isolation. The Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance split Europe into two armed camps, each suspicious of the other's next move. Nationalism was boiling over. Ethnic tensions simmered in the Balkans. Militaries grew rapidly. Generals promised quick victories in the next war, a war they believed would last months, not years. Then came the spark. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was assassinated in Sarajevo by a Serbian nationalist. In response, Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia. Serbia hesitated. Russia mobilized. Germany declared war on Russia. France followed. Then Britain. A regional incident spiraled into global war within weeks. But why? The answer lies not in a single event, but in decades of arrogance and fear. Leaders believed they could control the storm. They thought war would be swift and decisive. No one expected a stalemate. No one predicted the trenches. The Western Front froze into a 500-mile scar stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland. Soldiers, many barely out of school, were trapped in a nightmare of mud, barbed wire, artillery barrages, and gas attacks. Battle after battle, Verdun, the Somme, Passchendaele, brought staggering casualties for mere yards of ground. Millions died, often for nothing more than a change in map lines measured in inches. This wasn't the heroic war that poets had promised. It was mechanized slaughter. By 1918, the war had consumed 4 empires. The Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Russian, and German empires collapsed. Monarchies were overthrown. Economies were shattered. The social order of Europe had been forever changed. And yet, peace was elusive. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, aimed to end the conflict. Instead, it planted the seeds of the next one. The treaty punished Germany harshly, stripping it of territory, limiting its military, and demanding impossible reparations. The humiliation would fester. World War I, once called the war to end all wars, did no such thing. In hindsight, it was not just a war of weapons, but a war of miscalculations, of unchecked nationalism, of imperial pride and diplomatic failure. And its legacy lives on, not just in history books, but in the very shape of our world today. This was the cost of power pursued without foresight, and of pride unchecked by reason. It was a war no one truly won, and one the world must never forget. A fragile peace and the seeds of catastrophe. Between the wars. The First World War ended not with celebration, but with exhaustion. Europe was scarred, physically, emotionally, politically. In 1919, leaders from across the globe gathered at Versailles to build a new order. They promised peace, but wrote punishment. The Treaty of Versailles didn't just end the war, it fueled resentment, especially in Germany. The terms were harsh. Germany lost territory, colonies, pride, and was forced to accept full responsibility for the war. Worse still, it had to pay reparations so massive that its economy collapsed under the weight. As the 1920s unfolded, Germany spiraled into crisis. Hyperinflation turned savings into dust. Middle-class families carried wheelbarrows of cash to buy a loaf of bread. Hunger, unemployment, and despair spread through cities once proud and prosperous. Across the globe, the wounds of war had barely begun to heal when the Great Depression struck in 1929. Economic collapse spread like wildfire, crippling banks, paralyzing trade, and devastating working-class communities from Berlin to Boston. In Germany, chaos gave way to desperation, and desperation opened the door to extremism. Enter Adolf Hitler. He was not a man of compromise. He was a man of blame and promises. He spoke to the pain of the people and offered simple answers. The Jews, the communists, the treaty, the elites, they were the reason for Germany's downfall. Many didn't believe him at first, but they were tired, angry, and afraid. And when fear is louder than truth, democracy becomes fragile. Hitler rose to power in 1933, not through force, but through votes. The system broke from within. Meanwhile, the rest of the world watched nervously, but did little. Britain and France, still haunted by World War I, followed a strategy of appeasement. The idea was simple. Give Hitler what he wants, and maybe he'll stop. But dictators rarely stop. Every time Hitler crossed a line, rearming the military, marching into the Rhineland, annexing Austria, carving up Czechoslovakia, the world's response was silence, caution, delay. In that silence, Hitler heard opportunity. Elsewhere, fascism was spreading. Mussolini tightened his grip on Italy. Imperial Japan turned its sights toward expansion in Asia. Authoritarianism was no longer isolated. It was becoming the dominant language of power. The peace that followed World War I was a brittle illusion. It was built on denial, economic failure, and the hope that yesterday's horrors wouldn't return. But hope alone isn't a strategy. In this chapter of history, the lesson is not in the battles fought, but in the ones avoided, the warnings ignored, the voices silenced. World War II did not begin with gunfire. It began with neglect, with a fragile peace that cracked under the weight of fear, pride, and short-sightedness. And the price of that neglect would soon be paid on a global scale. The outbreak of war and catastrophic moves, World War II. The peace that followed World War I was shallow, fragile, and built on denial. By the end of the 1930s, that illusion had crumbled. Germany, under Adolf Hitler, had cast off the restraints of the Treaty of Versailles. He rearmed the military, annexed Austria, and dismantled Czechoslovakia, all under the watchful but hesitant eyes of Europe. Each bold move was met not with resistance, but with concession. It was the era of appeasement, an age when fear of war led to decisions that made war inevitable. Then came the final trigger. In August 1939, Hitler shocked the world by signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with his ideological enemy, Joseph Stalin. This secret agreement between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union wasn't just about non-aggression. It included a covert plan to carve up Eastern Europe. On September 1, 1939, German forces invaded Poland with a new, terrifying military strategy: Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Within weeks, Poland was crushed. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war. But it was too late. Over the next year, Hitler's forces swept across Western Europe with devastating speed. Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France fell one by one. In just 6 weeks, the seemingly impregnable French army had collapsed. Paris was occupied. Britain stood alone. Then came Hitler's gravest mistake. In 1941, driven by ideology and arrogance, he launched Operation Barbarossa, a full-scale invasion of the Soviet Union. He believed that the Red Army would collapse in weeks. Instead, the Germans faced brutal resistance and an unforgiving Russian winter. As German tanks bogged down in snow and mud, another strategic disaster was unfolding across the world. Japan, hungry for resources and dominance in Asia, attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Their goal was to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet and buy time for expansion. What they achieved instead was to awaken a sleeping giant. Just days later, Hitler made another catastrophic decision. He declared war on the United States. With that, the conflict became truly global. The Axis powers now faced the combined military and industrial might of the United States, the British Empire, and the Soviet Union. The war escalated into a nightmare of global proportions. Cities were firebombed. Civilians became targets. Genocide was industrialized. From Stalingrad to Midway, El Alamein to Normandy, the world became a battlefield. And behind every moment of chaos, every turning point, was a decision. These were not just military errors. They were choices made by men blinded by ambition, by hatred, by pride. Hitler believed his destiny was unshakable. Japan believed swift victory was possible. Italy believed it could share in the spoils. All were wrong. In this chapter, we look at these pivotal decisions, not just as points on a timeline, but as cautionary tales. World War II was not simply fate unfolding, it was the outcome of human error on a colossal scale. Misjudgment, overconfidence, and ideological extremism turned political tension into the most destructive war in human history. And in its aftermath, the world would never be the same again. Lessons from the ashes. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world stood in stunned silence. The Second World War had ended, not with glory, but with devastation. Across Europe and Asia, cities were reduced to rubble. Millions were dead. Entire communities wiped out. Economies collapsed. Borders redrawn. Families shattered. But perhaps the greatest wound was to the human spirit. The Holocaust had exposed the capacity for cruelty on a scale never before imagined. Hiroshima and Nagasaki revealed the dawn of a terrifying new age, the nuclear era, where a single bomb could destroy a city in an instant. World War II was the deadliest conflict in human history, but its lessons did not end with surrender. They began with reflection. The Nuremberg trials sought justice, not vengeance, for the architects of genocide and aggression. For the first time, leaders were held accountable not just for war crimes, but for crimes against humanity. In 1945, the United Nations was founded, not as a perfect institution, but as a shared promise, that dialogue could replace destruction, that cooperation could be stronger than conquest. Germany and Japan, once aggressors, emerged from the ashes with new constitutions, democratic systems, and a commitment to peace. Europe, tired of bloodshed, began the first steps toward integration, setting the foundation for what would become the European Union. But the peace was uneasy. The world quickly split again, this time not into empires, but ideologies. The Cold War emerged, with the US and the Soviet Union locked in a nuclear standoff. The fear of global annihilation never fully disappeared. Still, amid the fear, there was learning. The scars of the war became signposts, reminders of where hate, silence, and unchecked ambition can lead. These lessons echo to this day. That peace is not the absence of war, but the presence of justice. That democracy is fragile and must be protected from within. That evil doesn't always rise with violence. It often begins with words, with division, with silence. In this final chapter, we are not just looking back. We are looking forward. Because history is not just about what happened. It's about what could happen again. The ashes of war gave us painful wisdom. Whether we carry it with us or ignore it is a choice left to each generation. And the future depends on the questions we are brave enough to ask today. Echoes of war, reflections for the future. History does not whisper. It echoes. The two world wars were not just chapters of the past. They were loud warnings etched into the bones of cities, into the silence of lost generations, into the foundations of our modern world. We have studied the decisions that led us to disaster. We have witnessed the cost of pride, the consequences of inaction, and the weight of human suffering. And yet, the question remains, have we truly learned? The world today is again marked by division, tension, and rising nationalism. Alliances shift, weapons evolve, and once more, leaders make decisions that may shape the fate of millions. But history has gifted us a map, a painful, blood-stained guide that shows us where certain paths may lead. So the responsibility falls to us, this generation, and the next, to remember not just the names and dates, but the why, to challenge arrogance with wisdom, to answer hatred with understanding, and to hold peace as something more than the absence of war, but the presence of justice, dignity, and shared humanity. Because the next great struggle may not come with warning shots. It may come in silence, in complacency, in the slow forgetting of the past. The question is no longer if history will repeat. The question is, will we be ready when it happens? History is never just about the past. It lives in our decisions today. So as we look back on the ashes of yesterday, we must ask ourselves, what kind of future are we building now? If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful lessons from the pages of history.